In this episode, we meet Professor Peter Mackie, Executive Director of the Institute of Global Homelessness. Peter didn't set out to reshape how countries respond to homelessness. As a professor at Cardiff University, he led the research that informed the Housing Wales Act 2014, the legislation that made homelessness prevention a legal duty and drew international attention as one of the most significant reforms of its kind. A decade on, the law he helped build is part of the conversation everywhere he goes. In this episode, Peter talks about what it actually took to shift a country's approach from responding to homelessness after it happens to being legally required to act before it does. He reflects on what that model has achieved, where it falls short, and what it reveals about what's possible when political will matches the evidence. And he makes the case that homelessness has become normalised in ways that should be utterly unacceptable, and that COVID showed us exactly what's possible when a society decides something matters. More information on this interview can be found in the episode description. And don't forget to subscribe to the Char Hub podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from.
Peter, thanks so much for taking time to talk with us today. First, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be doing the work you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently Executive Director at the Institute of Global Homelessness, and that's an organisation, a very small organisation that works across the globe, trying to support cities to prevent and end homelessness. So that's my current day job. The majority of the team are based out in the US, in Chicago, and I'm based in Wales. And we're unique in that we work global north, global south, all regions. So that's the day job. I can talk more about IGH and what we do. But I think the reason for being on this call is that until November, I was a professor at Cardiff University in Wales, and I led the research that informed the Housing Wales Act 2014, which got coined as duty to assist. Nowhere in Wales is it referred to as duty to assist. That was a wonderful result of a discussion with Steve Gates in Canada, who translated it into something called duty to assist. And we're rubbish at naming things in Wales. It just gets called the Housing Wales Act 2014, et cetera, unlike our North American colleagues who are great at naming things. And duty to assist does capture exactly what the Housing Wales Act was about.
Given that significant transition from a sort of Cardiff academic to leading a global institute, what does that shift in vantage point reveal to you about homelessness that wasn't visible from a purely research side?
Yeah, well, I think partly because of most of my homelessness research was focused on the UK, to some extent Europe and North America, but that's where the focus was. Globally, there are lots of shared challenges. There are lots of very, very common routes into homelessness across the globe, all regions of the world, but the nature and scale of the challenge and the resources available vary, but also the role of community, family, networks varies significantly by region. So these are all things I was aware of before I went into the role, but it's, my everyday now is working within those different contexts to support cities, nations in their efforts to prevent and end homelessness. But the common thread is that we're trying to breathe into our conversations a lot more discussions about prevention and what that actually means, what that looks like, particularly using a typology that I worked with colleagues Suzanne Fitzpatrick and Jenny Wood to develop whilst I was still at Cardiff. So we have a typology of homelessness prevention that's just a really useful tool for starting that conversation, whether it's with a peak body like yours, or which we've done, or with a city government or a national government, about what are we doing at these different time points, essentially, to prevent and end homelessness. And there is just so much opportunity for learning across contexts.
We in New Zealand have quite a distinctive cultural context, with our foundation constitutional document being Te Tiriti o Waitangi. From your experience working internationally, how do you approach engaging with systems where Indigenous rights and locally grounded approaches are central?
Was a great question. Again, my experience in IGH, I started end of last year, so we've only been in 4 or 5 months. Most of the cities we're working in talk to some extent about that. But actually, the majority of my engagement on that has been with Canadian colleagues, where there's real consideration of Indigenous rights, the impacts of settlers and colonialism on Indigenous communities. And where I've seen best efforts, and actually, given that we're talking about duty to assist, I spent a couple of days in Winnipeg talking about duty to assist, but in an Indigenous-led event, Indigenous youth-led event, actually talking about what might duty to assist look like within our context, within our cultures, within our learnings and our teachings, and that was phenomenal. It took all sorts of different directions, but that's what happens when you take that approach and you work through Indigenous knowledges. I've also seen, again, my main experiences here in the Canadian context, wonderful efforts. You'll be very familiar with Housing First, which isn't a prevention response. It's a response to the most extreme form of exclusion in relation to homelessness. I'm aware of, in the Canadian context, a community who has taken Housing First and literally developed a 3D model that translates those principles of Housing First into Indigenous teachings and knowledges. And there's a 3D model that literally lets you understand and visualize how those talk to each other and what they mean for the communities there. So I'm most familiar with some of the work, incredible work, and incredible leaders, Indigenous leaders in response to homelessness in Canada. But crikey, it's still a major problem that they're nowhere near addressing the problem, but lots of good effort going in.
And just your reflections on the North American example, we must get you down here to New Zealand, because a couple of things that are playing out here very significantly and repetitively are climate change and the very significant impacts on our communities, and also a Manaaki approach of our Māori communities. We'd love to share that experience with you at some point.
Oh my goodness, no, I would absolutely love to experience that and to learn. Some of my previous research, actually outside of homelessness research, was in Kathmandu in Nepal. I did a large kind of cross-country comparative study that was in post-conflict cities. And I remember working with a group of researchers who were really reticent to go to some of the informal settlements in their own city. In fact, we were warned against it. And then a local community leader said, no, come in with us. And I remember going into this settlement by the riverbank, informal settlement. And it wasn't long after the 2016 major earthquake. And what this community had done is you had a maternity ward, a high-rise maternity hospital right next to the informal settlement. And when the earthquake hit, people just needed to find open land. And they went into this community that had been ostracized, that our researchers didn't really want to go into. Opened their doors, welcomed the women in, looked after those women during the earthquake. So those incredible welcoming contexts in some of the most marginalized and ostracized communities. These are lessons that we have to learn and hold up, don't we, internationally.
You've given a great example of translation of some of the work that you did in the duty to assist legislation across to North America. I'm interested, when people look at it from other countries, there's often interest in whether the elements could translate, particularly regards the typology of prevention, which spans from universal through to repeat prevention. In your experience, what do most governments currently invest in least? And where's the greatest leverage?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's probably worth just saying the typology sits separately from the legislation. The typology is a think piece, is an heuristic tool for thinking through policy practice. We can talk separately about the translation of duty to assist. The best example is Czech Republic. They have basically introduced it. We had a group of colleagues over to talk about that over to Wales last week, actually. It's more about, in many contexts, like Canadian contexts, it's about translating principles, but Czech Republic has actually translated the law. On the prevention typology, it's worth just saying that has 5 stages. You've got universal prevention. That is the things that we do population-wide to make sure that people are protected from homelessness. We talk about protective factors of having enough affordable homes where people want to live and that they can get access to. Those caveats are important. Build as many homes as you like in a place where nobody wants to go on the outskirts of Sao Paulo is actually not going to solve the problem. It has to be where people want to live, and you have to be able to access it. Don't go excluding migrants and other groups, or again, you'll still have lots of homelessness. So those protective factors of having enough affordable homes, about having a decent income in whatever form, whether it's access to jobs, inclusion of the informal economy in urban planning, or social welfare and welfare benefits in many northern states, but also access to good healthcare and, crucially, access to supportive, positive social relationships. Those 4 protective factors, and in different contexts, those are more or less important. But those are our fundamental keystones, our protective factors. Most nations are not doing very well at any of that, and I'm thinking about them in relation to prevention of homelessness. Then we talk about upstream prevention. That's where we could have a really big impact. And we know the routes into homelessness from things like prisons everywhere in the world. In my new job, everywhere I'm going, that is an issue. Everywhere. The child care system, whatever the nation calls that, again, it's almost ubiquitous across the world into homelessness through the child welfare system, children's care, through hospitals and healthcare systems, those and through refugee and asylum systems. Those are routes into homelessness almost everywhere. We know it. They're in places where we know the people are and can be helped, and yet we're not doing very well at stopping those routes into homelessness. So that's upstream. We know those populations are at risk because of these transitions, but also because of population groups who are known to be more at risk because of society. So LGBTQ plus young people are particularly at risk because of the way in which society behaves, et cetera, et cetera. So there are groups we know at greater risk, and that is where there's a massive opportunity to do far more. Most nations aren't really doing anything near the scale that they need to be doing. Then we get to crisis stage. That's where homelessness is foreseeable. Like we talked when we brought in duty to assist, it was within 56 days because that's how long you got when you got your eviction notice. We've changed that to 6 months. So now it's basically if you're going to be homeless within 6 months, then that's our crisis stage. You know it's coming. There's something very concrete, it's foreseeable. Globally, that's where if people are doing anything around prevention, they're doing it there. They're giving small amounts of rental assistance, they're giving rent in advance, they're liaising with landlords, those sorts of things. There's evidence across the world of pockets of that happening. There are very few nations that are doing that systematically. Wales is probably the greatest exception that developed duty to assist. You are, as a local authority, required to take reasonable steps to prevent homelessness. That's the duty. Whoever approaches you, the local authority has to try and prevent homelessness. So that's crisis stage, is where most, but still not anywhere near enough and not systematic, happens. Then we get into emergency stage. That's that if we don't act tonight, you're homeless tomorrow. And it's where we end up with our shelters and, if we're lucky, housing first, but generally, globally, still shelter-dominated, hostel-dominated, temporary accommodation. And then repeat homelessness is, look, in our solutions, and Katie, who you spoke to previously from Wales, leads on a lot of this work in Wales, is how do we stop people then becoming homeless again by making sure the right supports are in place and connections to family, connections to networks and those supportive networks. So that's the typology. We did an analysis, for instance, of funding on that in the UK, and you just see almost nothing in the early stages. There's a little bit on crisis and everything at point of emergency. That's where the money is spent. That's where the work goes. And it's one of our biggest challenges at the Institute of Global Homelessness is to say, yes, you need to, because you're saving lives there, you need to do that. And it's not an either or, you need to do that and this. You need to do the prevention work as well. It's not either or. And that's the challenge that you often get, is people think there's only one budget. But if you move upstream, and sorry to keep going, this is my passion project, but if you move upstream, normally you're not talking with the homelessness sector. You're trying to engage health, criminal justice, education, social care, business. We're doing some really fascinating work with businesses about their role in preventing homelessness. That's who you should be in conversation with, because it's their responsibility. And that's where we can have a really big impact, as well as these universal protective factors.
We're deeply interested in the upstream part of the conversation because really what we're observing in our context here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is the fruit of a whole range of structural decisions, housing system decisions, the obvious limits to the performance of the housing market, which simply does not serve the needs of low and moderate income households anymore. How do you build a compelling benefit analysis to encourage more upstream activity? We know it's the right thing to do. It's just trying to have a compelling case to change people's behaviour.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, there's a number of things in what you've said there. So the cost argument, I mean, that's been won a lot of times. The argument, there is the evidence there. The US is particularly good at delivering that evidence because the cost is borne normally through the health system. The cost of not intervening well is borne through the health system, and it's folk who are uninsured, and so there is literally a cost saving achieved. So there's lots of great evidence there. In many other nations, we're not so great with that that evidence base, but the impacts are still the same. And many same. It's just they're not as visible and as tangible to the health sector. You just see a queue reduce. That's all they'll see at best. So the cost benefit one, when you're talking about prevention, particularly for those individuals who may end up in hostels for long periods of time and in very expensive temporary accommodation, is an easily won argument. For the other part of the argument, which is how do we get those other sectors and actors engaged in the kind of more upstream work? Our biggest lesson internationally is political will. Undoubtedly, and it's finding those leaders and getting the political will. In Wales, some of the later, the duty to assist, the Housing Wales Act, was actually delivered more on consensus. That was less about political will and more about consensus within the sector that we just needed to fix the system. The more recent legislative reforms that have just been passed that move things even further upstream, that was, yes, there was lots of consensus and collaboration, but it had incredible political will. Housing is normally not the strongest partner around the table in government, but actually we had a housing minister in Wales who just said, right, we've got to make this happen, and I'll get Treasury on board, I'll get health, because I'm just going to bulldog this through. And it was incredible, phenomenal. I cannot speak more highly of the minister. And yes, there were compromises, there always are. And as an academic at the time, I was critical of all sorts of things that didn't get through. But we've got some great legislation, and we will iterate that. And that's one of the lessons, is you will never get perfect. There will be compromises all the way through. It's sad that we have to accept that, because this is people's lives. And I'm unapologetic about not wanting to compromise, but my experience is that is what happens in order to get these changes. So political will is out and out crucial. And sometimes data is very helpful as well. Knowing who is at risk and being able to make better use of data. And then oftentimes people will come on board. And the last example is, I'll give you a very concrete example, is the upstream intervention that's actually called upstream comes from Australia. The Geelong project in Australia is its origins. But the upstream project, again, a translational issue internationally about the actual intervention name, but it goes into schools, identifies young people at risk, and supports around family through family mediation, etc. When you can talk to schools, if you go into schools and say, we've got a homelessness prevention intervention, they're not particularly interested. in addressing homelessness, normally and sometimes explicitly, you're also addressing challenges around attendance at school. And through that comes attainment and other things around behaviour in school. These are the things that are really directly important to schools. Yes, they care about what's going on at home, but once the schools then see the other benefits, then they'll welcome you in and they'll work together, and you get these really positive outcomes. And that's the experience we had in schools.
Fantastic. I'm going to take you from the local and the school level to the global. You've worked across Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, and you're now working in a global role. I'm interested to hear your reflections on when countries make genuine progress. Are there patterns they tend to share beyond simply increased funding?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, sadly, there aren't many places that have made concrete progress. You'll know the main examples. The one that's always heralded is Finland, because they made most progress. But there are other nations that have done the same. No, it's not done the same at all. Have similarly made progress in a positive direction. That nearly always includes extending access to some form of affordable homes, whether they are in the private rent sector or they are social housing. You have made an investment in affordable social homes, and you're giving access to those homes to those most in need, i.e. people who are homeless. That's where progress is definitely made. We know that's a key ingredient. We know it in nations that make sure folk can afford the accommodation that's already out there. Japan being a really good example of that. The welfare system that supports people to access sometimes not the best quality accommodation, but there is accommodation available, and that welfare system is enabling people to access that. It's sufficient. Those two ingredients are absolutely crucial. And then, as we said before, political will normally has been required to see through the sort of change that's been successful.
There's a lot of work being done internationally. Words matter, right? Definitions matter. How much do you think the definition of homelessness itself shapes what a country is willing to measure and act on? And have you seen variations? Because you're in a unique position with a global oversight.
Yeah, it really, really does. I mean, it's one of our big agendas. And do you know, when I was more focused on the UK and parts of Europe, to me it mattered less because we were fairly consistent. In Europe, we had the ethos typology. Everyone bought into it. However, even then, even within the UK, between England and then the devolved nations, you'd get really different foci. We've only just managed to shift England towards recognising that you can't just focus on people who are sleeping on the streets. And actually, even if that is your focus, you need to act earlier with people who aren't yet on the streets, if that's your goal. That took a long time, even though the definition in law was a very, very broad one, one of the broadest globally. It really does matter. It also helps for that lesson learning, when you're talking about what's worked, understanding, so not just the literal situation of housing, but also the communities that are affected. So we always talk about the disaggregation of that data. What are the demographics of the population, the roots in, even age matters, gender matters, sexual identity matters. Those things affect how people experience homelessness. So we're really quite bad on homelessness data globally. We've got a homelessness, global homelessness data map. We look across the world, we look at what data is held, and the core minimum of what's collected isn't even comparable. But that's a big piece of work. The United Nations, we're working with UN Habitat at the moment on that, and there's about to be a paper that will come out that we're pushing for global commitment to a shared core set of definitions, the definitional framework that basically builds on the definitional framework that we've got, and that in itself builds on the ethos typology. That does help once you've got consistent terminology. It doesn't stop a nation or a city or a community saying, but we also want to do this. Brilliant. But at a minimum, let's have a common language. or particularly when you're working globally and you're in informal settlements or very large refugee camps, language matters.
And we are strong advocates for the right to a home. And yet, that's quite inspiring and gives us hope to hear you say that there is a global standard emerging, because I was going to ask about that and the extent to which context makes it difficult. But there are surely some base human realities which we all share in common.
There really, really are. Absolutely. Pretty much everywhere across the world. And it's also, so yes, it's also important to know that just because homelessness appears low in a nation doesn't mean there's not a challenge. You have to, and this is something that we do quite a lot, is we ask that question, why? Why is nobody on the street? Is it through criminalisation and policies like that can have all these other really negative and harmful unintended impacts and are, contrary to human rights? Those things matter. How you get there matters. It's not just about the numbers.
We've got some quite significant concerns in our New Zealand housing system at present, one of which is the proposal to stop completely our national census, which is the one opportunity we have to look inside individual households and see what the composition of those households is. And secondly, our government is considering move-on legislation, which would effectively make it illegal to be a rough sleeper or on the streets. And so there are very real present issues for us in our society here in New Zealand at the moment as we consider what sort of a country we want to be.
Yeah, that really matters. I mean, on both of those, we would argue that national census is the minimum core and the key opportunity to make sure you have at least some enumeration of the nature of homelessness in the nation. We're real advocates of having that as your minimum. Ideally, you have much more. You have routine data collections. Some nations will tell you, or cities will tell you, we've just got really good, up-to-date data that is far better than any census, and so you understand that. But in most nations and most communities, that's just not the case. Census is the bare minimum opportunity, and we do a lot of work around supporting cities to make sure that they collect that data. And on the move-on legislation, again, we're talking about infringements of human rights, and I know the UN Special Rapporteur, that's an area that they're very keen on. There was a recent statement led by Brazilian government actually, and had a number of signatories that talks about that as one of several points about stopping evictions, stopping those. Whatever the law is that's used to criminalise. I mean, we talk in the UK about removing the Vagrancy Act, but then the fear is that you've got other legal tools that basically criminalise other aspects of living on the street that enable you to achieve the same things. Those are worrying things. There are just much better solutions, and that whole point about what nation do we want to be, what sort of city do we want to be, that matters.
Good segue, Peter, there. One of the approaches we're very conscious about taking as a community body, as a peak body for community providers in New Zealand, is identifying those things that are working well, that we could all do more of, more often, and in more places, and identifying what works and doing that instead. At a system change level, and what works, there's a lot of appetite for housing first internationally. And we've had it operating for more than a decade here also in the New Zealand context very successfully. Do you think it's sometimes adopted more as a program or label than as a whole of system shift? And if so, what tends to get lost in translation?
Yes, there are very few nations that have adopted it systematically, for housing first specifically, but true of anything that's worked in this space. Steve Gates, Canadian colleague, wonderful Canadian colleague, talks a lot about this, and he talks about the health sector, where I can't quite remember, so please don't quote me on it, but it's something like it takes 17 years to get, a new drug into the community, and so I have another great colleague in Cardiff who worked on a completely different field, but talks about good policy being a slow mover. And that's what we've got. So Housing First, has just, initially it was very slow to translate, and then it's just been very, very slow, even once it has moved, to scale up. And that is true of so much of the good stuff and the good learning. So almost nowhere is it systematic. Finland is the poster case of having worked at scale, but it's Housing First as an intervention is not what Finland are doing. They've taken basically a housing-led, what they call a Housing First model, many of the same principles, but Housing First as a project was intended for a very specific subgroup of people experiencing homelessness with very high support needs. That's the Housing First intervention, born out of the US. The Finnish model is something different. It's about being housing-led, and the principles of being housing-ready, and there's no tests of readiness, etc. Finland did that, but they also, the way in which they did it is they just took a long-term vision and they said, let's get going. They didn't wait to be perfect. They said, first 5 years, let's take this principle of everybody's entitled to accommodation. But it was congregate accommodation that now you would say, actually, that's not wonderful. And then it moved to, in the following 5 years, more segregated accommodation, etc. But it was a long-term vision, a long-term commitment, enabled through funding and social welfare system that they've got. But there are very few nations that have taken that long-term vision, and that's partly a problem of politics. Wales is another good example, partly because there's always been the same party at the table in some form. It's nearly always had cross-party support, so it's not entirely just about party politics. But when you've got the same party either in a coalition or in on their own, it does enable this long-term vision and seeing a vision through. And that's why in most nations that's not the case. You need that cross-party buy-in when you're setting out this vision and this: what nation do we want to be? What approach do we want to take? We want to be housing-led. We're moving away from housing readiness. How do we move away from a temporary hostel shelter, whatever the terminology is that you've got? How do we move away from that being our default response to being people into homes? That's the big mindset shift at point of crisis. And then I would lean to places like Wales on what does prevention look like in a systematic way, where we're reaching out to everybody and offering support before homelessness.
We in the New Zealand context had benefited from that sort of Welsh scenario all through the 40s, 50s, 60s, even through into the mid to late 1980s. Our social and affordable housing system was the envy of the Western world, and then we totally swallowed the neoliberal economic model. And it took about 20 years to burn off all the fat that we had because the system was so good, and it wasn't immediately obvious that the market had the severe limitations that it does. Despite all of that, and despite us having more homelessness and rough sleeping in New Zealand today than ever in our history, we actually believe we can fix it. And we're relentlessly optimistic about our capacity to do that, should there be the political will and the conditions to facilitate that. I'm interested in your international reflections on what genuine systems change actually looks like on the ground. Is there a city or country you could point to as having moved from isolated programs to something more structural?
Great question. There will be many examples, I'm sure, in different very specific contexts. So, for instance, in the child welfare system, where there's been a really systematic shift, or in the criminal justice system, where there's been a systematic shift, all those being roots in, there will be lots of examples of that where you've just made a really deliberate decision around asylum and refugee systems. Sadly, at the moment, I think most of those systems have shifted in the opposite direction to the one that we would want. Internationally is working against us, most of those system shifts. But let me just give you one example, just because it's closest to home and most, not that long ago. We reviewed the prison system and the fact that it was driving homelessness in Wales. And there was a piece of research commissioned to evaluate what was happening in the adult prison system. It talked about many of the things that we'd expect. There was lots of challenges, still lots of people becoming homeless despite legislation, despite protocols and agreements. And we were tasked with looking at the same context for young people. And I think there were 4 people who became homeless. And you know why? It wasn't because they were doing lots to prevent homelessness. It's because they were not putting young people into the criminal justice system, into secure state. And so you weren't then having the discharge. So they'd completely rethought the criminal justice system for young people, and that had the positive impact. So there are bound to be many examples of those drivers in where there's been a fundamental rethink of that system and it's had positive impacts. You can imagine the same in the education system. There are parts of mainland Europe where they've just really prioritised well-being. And New Zealand's probably a good example of this. You prioritise well-being, and the probably unintended impacts there may well be really unintended impacts of that on youth homelessness. I don't know in the New Zealand context, but I could imagine it being possible. So there'll be really interesting system changes outside of our known system, but that are having an impact on homelessness. And then in the actual homelessness system, Scotland, where they said, we're stopping using shelters. We don't accept these anymore. And we're going to work to close them, and we're not going to open anymore. And they did it. They've achieved that. There's a small move back, and they're facing some challenges now. And they have a legal entitlement to housing for everybody. Everybody is entitled to a home in Scotland. And it's a really conscious decision that said this isn't part of a system that we want. And then the Welsh example of prevention, saying we want to prioritise this. And partly it happened because we had legislation that says you are entitled to temporary accommodation and then ultimately social housing if you become homeless, but we're only going to give it to some, mostly families. And that was really problematic because there were lots of people that couldn't access anything. They got nothing. And it meant if somebody came to the door and they were at risk of losing a flat, legitimately you couldn't help them because they were entitled to this other thing. And so there was a systematic change to say we're going to prioritise prevention. That is, you are entitled to this assistance. Now in the UK, it's nearly always the law is used, but in other places that will be done through funding. You know, in the US, Housing First and the money for supported housing is done through federal funding into communities and through the states. That's a funding mechanism, and that's what we've seen shift in the US recently and move away from Housing First and supportive housing, though it's been challenged in the courts. And there are a number of mechanisms that you can use to achieve that system change. Some of the best examples that I'm seeing emerging in this new role are, for instance, in Uruguay and Brazil, where you've got very, very effective and well integrated coalitions of people with lived experience of homelessness. They are constituted as organisations and they are driving change. They have a seat at the table. That is another mechanism. And it's not either or. All these can exist in parallel.
Excellent examples. And Scotland resonates also because we were watching with great interest and delight the recent passing of legislation just a few weeks ago in building community wealth. One of the concepts that we're developing here, which is based off a Māori cultural practice of papakainga, which is commonly held land for the benefit of the community, this idea of intentionally, proactively and aggressively growing the amount of housing stock that we hold within civil society organisations and permanently removing it from the market because we can't trust the market to deliver anymore for our communities.
No, that sounds inspiring. I'd love to learn more. That's brilliant. That's brilliant. That's exactly the sort of radical shift that we need because the markets won't deliver. I remember having an argument with an economist I used to know that says, Pete, you know, if there's a way to make money, the market will deliver. No, it doesn't.
No, it's not interested in meeting the needs of low-income people.
And that's where government normally has to step in, or in the absence of government, and alongside, as you said, community. I think I would love to know more.
Now look, as we come to a close, I'm interested to speak to data measurement and such like, because they're constantly coming up. And we're having a battle here in New Zealand context where some of the filtering, the political filtering of data means that stuff we're seeing published doesn't seem to really accurately reflect what we're seeing on our streets and in our communities. What would you say is the minimum a country needs in terms of data infrastructure to drive change, and what is the most common failure you see?
Oh, good question. There's probably no absolute, you must have. It will vary by context, but the direction in which we're traveling internationally around definition is we're talking about people who are on the streets, or they don't have accommodation, or they are in accommodation for people who are experiencing homelessness, so hostels, shelters. That's the minimum that we would anticipate cities and nations collecting data on, and that should be disaggregated as best you can to understand the nature of the people experiencing homelessness. Who is it that's experiencing homelessness? That's the direction of travel. For me, and we always talk about it at IGH, it needs to be actionable data, is the phrase we use. It has to be not data for data's sake, but it's data that then is going to let you and enable you to act, which for us normally means you need to know the routes in. And sometimes they're really proximate routes in. How did you end up here? Where were you in the last 2 or 3 months? Where were people accommodated previously? So that you can see those immediate routes in. Now, that doesn't tell you enough about the longer pathway in that people will have taken. And we know that is often driven by wider structural factors. But for instance, if it's evictions from the private rented sector, that leads you to what can we do? You might well find you've got a small group of landlords who are causing an awful lot of homelessness, for instance. Anyway, so having some information on routes in, at least proximate routes in, is really helpful for actionable data. And here's the other thing, is we tend to think, well, that's got to be the homelessness sector collecting that data, right? We thought that. We generally work with the homeless sector and government and local authority to work on that. But we were just on a call with one city in Africa, and they didn't realise that the police had the most amazing data set on the homeless population in their city. And it turns out, here's the story. I won't name the city, but the city had collected data, and the NGO, a peak body type organisation like yours, had said this is a massive underestimate by like 10,000 or something. I can't remember the figures. And that had happened a year or so, 2 years ago, and that was the data they were both working with. And then they both discovered that the police had this incredible data set, really up to date, monthly updated. And it was in line with the peak body data. So that triangulation told you, actually, we know the nature, but also there's some really rich intelligence there. And I guess where I'm going with that is that there are lots of routes in through which we can build a picture of who is experiencing homelessness. Yes, we want that collected by the state, because the state ultimately should have responsibility here to act. Yes, that should be publicly available. At a minimum, we would anticipate that a census includes people who are experiencing homelessness. But in the absence, and also there are other actors who have data, and let's make use of it. Personally, before I joined IGH, I did a whole load of work with administrative data. We had a whole program of work on homelessness, on administrative data around homelessness. And we were able to identify people during COVID. There was no data on the homeless population, but we were able to use health data and able to tell you the prevalence rate of COVID for people experiencing homelessness through the health data, and then go on to talk about vaccination rates. There's this much wider data set that can be used for action. Again, always for action. For what purpose?
I love that translational focus in terms of making sure that it's actually data that is designed to support better decision making. Let's go from the deeply detailed, one final question, if I may, to the super high level, global, philosophical. If you had a view of the future and looked 5 years down the line, If you could move one thing with governments worldwide, particularly with regards to their approach to homelessness, not a program, more a mindset or a structural assumption, what would that be? What would you be doing?
I think we need to start seeing homelessness as any number of words, but either as a major crisis, as a human rights violation, as something not to be accepted, as something utterly unacceptable for our societies, whatever combination of wording you like, but that we see it as such an urgent issue in the way that we did when COVID came. Homelessness almost all of a sudden became this massive priority. And I'll give you another anecdote. I'd been on a working group that was designing what a whole combination of policies and practices would look like to end homelessness in Wales. And we set out the recommendations, and the report was in March 2020, and it was published just as COVID hit. And what we were being told was, we're talking about a 10-year timeline for this. And the recommendations, which included shifting away from, that nobody should be on the streets and we should treat that with urgency, this 10-year timeline happened overnight. Because it got treated with the urgency that we've been saying it should be. There are nations where nobody dies on the street. Now, again, the why, some of the policies that are in place that are enabling that are not necessarily the policies and practices you want to follow, but they are. It's treated as an emergency. An emergency is called if somebody dies, and there's a massive case review. How did this happen? In many advanced economies, it's normal. You're just one of thousands in statistics. That's utterly unacceptable. So we need a shift in mindset that says this is unacceptable. As it was in not too many decades ago in many countries, it was really unusual to see somebody on the streets, and then it became normal, and it became part of people's everyday. And we need to get to a position where that's utterly unacceptable. And we're asking why on earth we're allowing that to happen. I think that shift in mindset will drive a lot of the other things. They'll come looking for the policies and the practices, the work of which we've got a lot to say.
Peter, we're really grateful for your time, your expertise, your global oversight, and really looking forward to sending you a copy of the next edition of our Insight Report. Thank you so much for your time and joining us today from Wales.
Thanks so much, Paul.
We'd like to thank Professor Peter Mackie for taking the time to speak with us for this episode. More information on this interview can be found in the episode description. And don't forget to subscribe to the Char Hub podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from.